Hello and welcome back to CalisPrep's SAT Writing and Language course. Today we're going to be looking at passage development. So what passage development really entails is just the way that a passage is built. So most will start with kind of an introduction, then move on to some examples or a counter argument, and then conclude by reiterating what has been already stated. But mind you, that's only the most basic structure for a passage. You'll see all sorts of different kinds of passages on the test, because every SAT writing and language section will include that humanities, social science, science, and careers passage. And now each of those will be structured slightly differently, so you really have to be able to kind of adjust on the fly when looking for passage development. It's not something that you can know what to expect, but you have to build as you go through the passage. So on the SAT itself, what you'll be asked to do on these passage development questions is you're going to have to basically supply an introduction, a conclusion, or an example for the passage. And you're going to have to keep in line with what's already been discussed in the passage. So that's really knowing how the passage is organized and how it's flowing. And in addition to that, sometimes you're going to have to decide whether or not a sentence is appropriate to add in a certain spot. So they'll give you a sentence that's not already in the passage and ask you, hey, should we add this or should we not add it? And you'll just have to decide whether it fits or not. So just our quick tips and tricks things here. As always, we're going to be paying attention to the process of elimination, because that's always the best way to reduce the number of answers we have to worry about and get it down to just the ones that look like they might fit. And we're also going to learn how to kind of determine what it is that we're looking at here with each passage before we get into it. Now, mind you, the example we look at today will be pretty simple because it's a very short passage, so it's very easy to determine what's being talked about here. But with that in mind, let's jump right into the passage and take a look at this one on Gothic architecture. Now, this will consist of kind of two halves. This is the first half of the passage, then we'll go on and look at the other half and a couple more questions. But for now, go ahead, pause the video, and read this paragraph on Gothic architecture. And when you've read it, go ahead, press play, and we'll look at the development together. All right, now that we've had a minute to look at this, let's jump right into the question here. So what we're being asked to do is we're being asked to find which choice adds the most effective supporting detail to the underlined portion. Or rather at the underlined portion. So what we want to do here is determine what's been talked about already and what logically would follow from that. And I won't go ahead and read the whole passage to you because presumably you've already read it, but let's look at some key features here. We're talking about an architectural style called Gothic architecture, and we know when it's prevalent. We know when the term was invented. It wasn't invented during Gothic architecture's heyday, but rather later, during the Renaissance. And we know who invented this term, Gothic architecture. It was critics of the style. So now the only question left is, why did these critics call it Gothic architecture? That's the question we want answered based on these first two sentences and the information contained in them. So what we want to do here is look for an answer choice that answers that question. Why is it called Gothic architecture? And when we look at our answer choices, we see that really A is going to be the best one for this. A is telling us that, hey, look, the critics, they called it Gothic architecture because they thought it was barbaric and it resembled the architecture of the Goths, the people who sacked Rome, which kind of makes sense. We know that these critics favor Roman and Greek architecture. So the critics of Gothic architecture would call Gothic architecture something that's bad to Romans or bad to Roman architecture. So why not Gothic, the people who sacked Rome? Good. So we can see how this development kind of works based on this one example. What we have to do is we have to understand how the argument or how the passage is progressing, what ideas are being presented, and what information is missing. Because often the SAT is going to have you fill in that missing information with what's most logical. So just before we go on and choose A, let's make sure these other ones don't work. So B is not going to be what we're looking for here because it's kind of providing a shift that yet says we're having contrast. And then the used mostly in ecclesiastical architecture or religious architecture, well, that's not really a contrast. That's just another fact. So B is inappropriate because it's not answering the question that A does, and it's forming a contrast where there really is no contrast. So in C, we have the critics preferred the more classical architecture popularized by the Greeks and Romans. Well, that was implied. We could tell from the earlier sentence, these critics felt that Gothic style was uncivilized, abandonment of Greek and Roman styles. That tells us enough. C is therefore redundant. We could kind of guess C, so we can get rid of it. And then we've got D. And this one is just saying where you can find Gothic architecture, but we already knew that we could find it in Europe, and it was built in the 12th to 16th centuries. Again, D is redundant, so it's not really developing the passage, it's kind of stalling it with stuff we already know. So we know that A is going to be the correct answer here, and we can move on to the next half of this passage and a couple more development style questions. So here we have the second half of this passage. Go ahead, again, pause the video, read the second half, and we'll continue once you've had a chance to read it. All right, hopefully you've had enough time to read that one as well. So again, let's not read the whole passage over again, but rather just pick up from what the question is asking us to do. So here, the question is asking us which choice most effectively establishes the argument that follows. All right, so what we have to do here is really think of what we call a topic sentence. And in order to do that, we have to determine what is the topic of this paragraph based on what they're talking about throughout. So we can kind of quickly go through here, and we see that the Gothic style makes use of arches holding up the roof. We've got the term ribbed vault. We've got flying buttresses, and these are all architectural features that tell you how Gothic architecture has a distinct style, or what makes it distinct. And you can see the focus is really on the walls and the roof, or those flying buttresses on the roof. So we can determine that the topic sentence wants to talk about the features of Gothic architecture that make it unique. And when we check out our answer choices here, well, we'll start with A. And that's during the development of Gothic architecture, much of the Muslim world was undergoing a sort of renaissance. Now, we did talk about the Muslim world in the last paragraph, if you remember. We said that maybe Gothic architecture was inspired by Muslim styles. But this paragraph, the one we're looking at now, that has really no mention of Muslim culture or Muslim art. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of answer choice A. It's shifting the focus by relying too much on the previous paragraph. So we can check out B. Now, this one is saying that the term Gothic was later applied to other forms of art. Again, this is not good. This is not an introduction for what we're looking for. We're looking for the unique architectural features of Gothic architecture, not how Gothic was applied later to other forms of art. B, no good. It's shifting the focus too much. Now we've got C, and that one's just saying the most recognizable Gothic structure is the Cathedral at Notre Dame. Rather, the Cathedral Notre Dame in Paris. Again, this one is providing a problem. We don't mention specific examples elsewhere in this paragraph. And we don't even know if Notre Dame, this very famous cathedral, has the features discussed here, the ribbed vaults and the flying buttresses. Therefore, we are pretty confident C is no good too. Now, we've used process elimination to be left only with D. Let's just make sure that D is going to work before we go with it as our answer. Now, D is telling us that the most important change to architecture during the Gothic period was the way that roofs were constructed. Now, this is perfect because we know that we're talking about the construction of Gothic structures. We're saying that they have these ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, all these unique features in their architecture. Therefore, it makes sense to have the intro say, hey, look, there's something unique about Gothic architecture. Good. So we know D is doing a perfect job of setting up the rest of this paragraph, which is talking about unique architectural features. So we can move on to one last question here. Now, we'll see that this final paragraph is exactly what we just saw. We just switched out the more appropriate second topic sentence here. So now we've got the right topic sentence, and we see that we've got a number 3 at the end. Now, for number 3, the writer is thinking of adding the following sentence, and that sentence reads, such roofs make it possible to create taller buildings with vast, well-lit spaces inside. Good, so this is keeping with our theme established by the intro, that we're talking about Gothic architecture, roofs, Gothic architecture, special features. So we can kind of guess based on just that yeah, this is probably a good sentence to add. It's keeping with the development, the tone, and the style of the passage. So we're going to almost automatically go for that yes answer. What we want to first do is eliminate the no's to make sure that we don't have to worry about those. So what we can do here is kind of look at C and see that it's not really distracting from anything because the focus of the passage is not Gothic architecture's cultural impact. Rather, it's sort of an overview of Gothic architecture and its special features. So we know that C is no good, and we know that D is no good because really it's that's not at all what the final sentence is really focusing on. So D is kind of irrelevant. D is kind of doesn't make any sense. So we know that the no answers are no good. We can cross out C and D, and we can focus on A and B now. So we know the answer is yes, we want to add the sentence. The question is why. Now, when we look at A, it says because it effectively refutes the criticisms, and we can stop there. We don't even need to read the rest, because we have to ask, is that addressing any criticism? Well, no. The critics in paragraph 1 were saying that it was a barbaric style. And of course, taller buildings with well-lit spaces doesn't sound barbaric, but there's no direct link between the criticisms in paragraph 1 and this sentence in paragraph 2. So A is creating a false link. We can get rid of it. And again, we're at process of elimination is giving us B. So all we have to do is make sure that B makes sense. And that one's saying that it summarized the benefits of the architectural features mentioned previously. A fancy way of saying it's explaining why flying buttresses and ribbed vaults are good. And that's true. It's doing exactly that. It's saying that these special features of Gothic architecture made for really big, open, pretty buildings with lots of windows. Yeah, that makes sense. That's really doing a good job of developing the paragraph in such a way that we present the topic in the intro. We then say what's special about the topic, the ribbed vaults and the flying buttresses, and then we go on to elaborate on that. We say these things are important because, and they create taller buildings with big windows. So good, we're very confident that B is going to be the best answer here, so we're going to go with that one. And that's going to close out this passage today. So these are really the 3 basic ways that you're going to see the SAT testing paragraph or passage development. They're going to ask you possibly to add an intro or a conclusion. They're going to ask you, well, should we add this sentence at all? And they'll probably ask you to add a few phrases or something that provide solid examples or elaborations on stuff that's already been talked about. So that covers everything for today. Thanks again for tuning in to Callus Prep, and next time we'll be looking at how passages are organized in the SAT Writing and Language Test and how they're going to test you on that organization.